afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is May the 20th, 140th day of the year. 225th day of 225 days remain to the year's over with. It's also the last day of the Taurus zodiac sign. Holidays and observances. It's World Bee Day. Support bee conservation by donating to your favorite beehive. National Rescue Dog Day. National Streaming Day. National Be a Millionaire Day. You usually can't become a millionaire in a day unless you win the lottery. National Keisha Lorraine Day. National Band Directors Day. The National Clinical Trials Day, Weights and Measures Day, National Women in Aerospace Day, National Pick Strawberries Day, National High Heel Day, and National Academic Freedom Day, National Stop Nausea Day, Autoimmune Arthritis Day, Liza Doolittle Day, National Sugar Bee Apple Day, and National Red Sneakers Day. I guess it goes with the Red Hat Society. The National Heritage Breeds Week, Cannes Film Festival ends Saturday, 24th, Be Nice to Nettles Week, and Dementia Action Week. All that having been said, let's see what's in the news. Of course, you heard President Biden has prostate cancer. California athlete got praise for posing briefly on the first place podium after losing to a trans athlete. Reese Hogan was among the athletes who were ordered to remove Protect Girls sports shirts at a previous meet. California's doing everything it can to protect the rights of the transgenders. Minneapolis police chief and blasts the city's bizarre liberal ideology after George Floyd. Floyd actually was a drug user and a criminal, and it's said, from what I read, that he may well have died from reaction to fentanyl as opposed to anything that was done by the police officers. But of course, the left has celebrated him as just short of a saint. Well, more federal charges have been filed against Representative McIver regarding over the confrontation at the ICE facility. She wanted to stand up for the rights of the undocumented, and now she may wind up losing her place in Congress. Well, the Trump administration has lifted a stop work order on a $5 million New York offshore wind project. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum told Ecuador last month to stop construction. We'll see what comes of that. Larry McCaskill, who is a former senator, said America isn't smart enough to keep Trump out of the White House, which says how she views most Americans. She's a former Democratic senator. She said Americans just aren't smart enough to keep him out of the White House. We should have put Biden or Harris in, and then we'd all be speaking probably Chinese by this point. Bill Maher is on SNL broke a key rule of comedy when they portrayed Trump supporters as racist. Cole Hauser, a star in Yellowstone, talking about a spinoff regarding American cowboys. Diddy's former assistant talks about fearing for his life after he had a run-in with Suge Knight. ex-FBI agent said the Orleans Parish jail staff helped the 10 inmates with their escape. 4 have now been recaptured. And allegedly, there's an investigation going on to how all this came about. Federal charges have been filed against Representative McIver. RFK Jr. is on the Hill to defend Trump's health agenda. He wants to put patients first, which would be something totally new to the VA, let me tell you. The CNN is denying that they covered up Biden's health issues, but the facts are there. Kentucky volunteers and first responders are trying to help in the recovery efforts in the wake of a string of deadly tornadoes. A retired 4-star Navy admiral, a former second in command of the Navy, been convicted in a corruption case. Retired 4-star Admiral Robert Burke found guilty in a scheme to direct contracts to certain contractors in exchange for a $500,000 a year job. Trump is facing an uphill battle to get enough House votes for his, what he calls his big, beautiful tax bill. Trump is defending his post about Trump. He says it was totally innocent. The mere fact 8647 actually means do away with the 47th president. We shouldn't be looking at that. All right. According to Schumer, anything that is negative in the world is Trump's fault. The Mexican ship that hit the bridge was Trump's fault. A woman with a rare mint allergy has been hospitalized over a dozen times. She wishes she was allergic to peanuts instead. There's a bunch of Memorial Day sales coming up. Up to 64% off Home Depot, Walmart, Amazon, Wayfair, and other stores. Sales on everything you can imagine. Former Biden advisor said he didn't suddenly develop cancer in less than 100 days, but that's what they would have us believe. And according to McCaskill, the American public is just too dumb to know reality. I'm sure if she runs again, it's going to come back to haunt her. Trump has been discussing the Ukraine war with Putin in a 2-hour phone call. Soros-backed Philadelphia DA is facing an uphill battle for re-election. The GOP write-in scheme succeeds. Democrat by the name of Pat Dugan is gaining GOP support in a write-in campaign that could give him another go against Soros-backed DA Larry Krasner. Soros's checkbook has caused a lot of troubles in this country. Expert has revealed how companies are rebranding their DEI policies in order to get around the Trump-era bans. It's the same old thing with a new name. A company called Consumers Research is at the forefront of pushing back against DEI and woke hospitals. Let's see, what else we got? Texas senators are seeking reimbursement for the cost that Texas has had to undertake during the Biden administration. Biden opened the doors and said, "Come on down." Musk is going to remain the Tesla CEO in spite of demands he stepped down. And let's see. Biden's Justice Department had gone after Southwest, and Trump's Justice Department is abandoning that. A woman in the UK, I think, yes, the UK, faces the risk of a rare spinal condition brought on by yoga poses. She said they led to slip disc, cauda equina syndrome, traumatic and life-changing, according to this woman. A fisherman has discovered a 100-year-old shipwreck in the Great Lakes. It's Lake Michigan. It's a long-lost shipwreck. It's a tugboat called the J.C. Ames, built for the lumber trade in 1881. It was sunk in 1923. And this fisherman, Christopher Stuss, discovered the ship one foggy day near the coast of Manitowoc, sitting 9 feet below the surface. He reported it to officials, of course. Caitlin Clark is back in the news. She's been accused of hate speech against Angel Reese. Even though Reese did everything she could to cripple Clark. But Reese is a black female, so she can do no wrong in the eyes of the left. Let's see, is there anything else? Office of Management and Budget says Trump is defunding Biden's woke and weaponized bureaucracy. And it's about time, let me say. All right. Well, we're going to talk about what's been referred to as a conspiracy of silence in regard to UFOs. Now, of course, the term UFO has been replaced with UAV. Unidentified aerial vehicles, as opposed to unidentified flying objects. It's the same thing. Now, the subject of UFOs has been controversial. In a number of recent years, some of the stigma has decreased. In fact, I saw something last night that a lot of military encounters with UFOs are now being talked about. But if you want to see how the stigma operates, attend a public gathering and start talking about UFOs. You're going to have some people receptive and some people are going to look at you like you're crazy. Now, the stigma of UFO alone is still compelling enough to keep most people quiet about the subject. But for those who have talked about it, there's been a much more aggressive barrier that has had to be addressed. They found themselves confronted with forces that seek to either silence them vocally or permanently. A number of folks have actually been killed who talked about UFOs. One of the best known was Albert K. Bender. We have to go back to 1952 to talk about this one. That was the height of a UFO wave in the U.S. that included a flyover of Washington, D.C. And Albert Bender decided he wanted to get to the bottom of what was going on. So he formed a group of people and created what he called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Became the publisher of a magazine on the subject called the Space Review. Now, it was an almost laughable attempt by a young man trying to become involved in the UFO phenomena. And a lot of people did laugh at it until Bender seemed to get too close to something. Well, as it turned out, there were a lot of people interested in his UFO group, and soon he had people from far and wide wanting to take part. The fact is, the International Flying Saucer Bureau became a hub of activity, a center that got UFO reports from literally all over the world. In the first few months of its existence, it became one of the most popular organizations of its time. And it was just when that group was at its most popular that Bender suddenly shut the whole thing down and said he wasn't going to talk about UFOs anymore. Well, some folks asked, was he tired of the subject? And those that knew him, and the fact that he was very passionate about the topic, thought it was hard to believe he suddenly had a change of heart. So the question becomes, what happened? Why did he suddenly do what many people thought was an about-face? Well, it was later learned that there might have been some kind of outside intervention that caused Bender to shut up. It reported he was visited by none other than the infamous Men in Black. And later on, a lot of details have come out about what happened to him. At the time, he was in his early 30s and living in the attic of his stepfather's house. And it was there in this attic room that a strange activity that ultimately culminated in his being silenced first began to take shape. Now, according to what was pieced together, the campaign to silence Bender began with strange phone calls. They always came when he was alone, as if whoever was calling knew he was alone. You'd hear the phone ring, you'd come down from the attic, answer it, and they hear strange electronic sounds, or sometimes nothing at all. But even if there was nobody on the other end, Bender had the feeling he was not only being listened to, but he was being watched. Next thing that happened, he went to a local movie theater to watch a sci-fi film. This is in the 50s, and when classic alien invasion films are all the rage, you might be tempted to think it was all of the scary movies he'd been watching that might have inspired his imagination to run away with him in the first place. But when he left the movie theater, not only did he think he's being watched, he thought he was being followed. He had a distinct feeling somebody was following him, even as he walked home from the movies. When he got home, he went up to his attic room, shut the door, and thought he'd shut out whatever had been bothering him. But when he got into his attic room, hovering right in front of him was some kind of glowing orb of light. Well, he cut on the right in the loom, and as soon as he did, that ball of light disappeared. Well, as strange and as unnerving as this was, it happened so quickly, he still had some plausible deniability at this point. He could easily pass this off as his tired, weary eyes playing tricks on him. But for some reason, and for anyone who's researched paranormal phenomena, it often seems that exposure to the paranormal happens in gradual degrees, sort of testing the limits of somebody's rational acceptance. Almost as if it needs a willing host, the paranormal waits to see if the experiencer will accept the phenomenon or throws your minds off to it. And Bender, for his part, was relatively open-minded. Soon enough, it'd be his open mind, it would be his undoing. And for Bender himself, he was apparently forced to issue. Through his magazine, Space Review, he put out a call to all his followers to mark a specific date, March 1953, on their calendar. The day upon which they would all attempt to make contact with extraterrestrials. Now, it remains unclear what even gave him the idea in the first place, but somehow he formed the idea in his head that if all the readers of his magazine chose a specific date and thought the same exact thoughts about how they wanted to contact ETs at the exact same time, that would actually facilitate some sort of contact. At first glance, you might think this absurd. It's worth noting, though, but by the 2020s, a lot of leading UFO researchers have concluded there is a psychic element to UFO encounters. And what once seemed laughable and absurd is now considered a valid part of the phenomenon. Well, Bender was apparently ready to give it a shot, and essentially declared March 15th of that year to be Contact Day. Published a special message that appeared in his magazine, encouraged his followers to cite it in their minds when the designated time arrived. And the words of his proposed contact message to aliens would later be picked up by a rock band called Klaatu and further made famous when performed by the popular 1970s group The Carpenters. I mean, you might be familiar with Karen Carpenter singing the words calling the occupants of interplanetary craft. Well, the song's lyrics were derived directly from Bender's original message to aliens. Although there's no way of knowing how many of his followers actually set aside time, March 15th, to try and summon the UFOs and the aliens, Bender almost certainly did. At the appointed time, he lay down on his bed in his attic and recited his pre-written contact message in his mind. And a short time later, began to feel strange. He felt a cold chill in the room. He had to experience a bad headache. And he suddenly smelled a terrible odor. It seemed almost like rotten eggs. He was against this backdrop, he suddenly beheld a flash of blue light. And after that flash of blue light, he had an out-of-body experience in which he was hovering as a spirit or a form of pure consciousness right over his own body. And it was while he was in this embodied state that otherworldly entities made good under his request for contact. It wasn't the friendly response he'd been hoping for. He apparently heard a voice that informed him his actions had been observed, and he was cautioned to cease and desist with his meddling with the mysteries of the universe. And he was given a final warning stating if he didn't stop looking into UFOs, they'd make an appearance. And although Bender had spent several months trying to get aliens to appear to him, he now seemed to be using that very idea of actually showing up as some kind of threat. And contrary to his previous wishful musings about how grand contact with aliens would be, these entities made it clear they actually arrived. If they actually arrived for a prolonged visit, he would not like it. Well, they cautioned him that if he didn't stop investigating UFOs, they would appear in front of him, and they made it clear that appearing before him was the last thing he wanted to have happen. Well, he was as shocked as he was disappointed and tried to question the authoritative entity that spoke to him. He said, "Why aren't you friendly to us?" And that entity responded, he and his fellow ETs were on a special assignment on the Earth, and they wouldn't tolerate their mission being disturbed by any pesky humans like Bender. And then once again reiterated if he knew what was good for him, he'd stop his research and discussions about the UFO phenomena once and for all. Well, it was after these final warnings were made that he suddenly returned to his body, gasping for air on his attic room bed. And considering the fact he was in bed at the time, even at this point, there was still some room for plausible deniability. Distressing as the experience was, he still could have laughed it off as just being part of his imagination. The one thing making that line of thinking difficult was that as soon as he opened his eyes, he could have sworn he saw a dark humanoid shape standing in the corner. It vanished within seconds, but he knew he had seen it standing there. And this strange aberration seemed to be a subtle confirmation he wasn't dreaming at all. He had indeed made contact, and unfortunately, the contact he made wasn't good. Well, he was highly conflicted about the encounter. Part of him wanted to go straight to his magazine and publish the details of what had happened, but he didn't do that for two reasons. Number one, he felt that his account was so strange that a lot of folks, even UFO enthusiasts, wouldn't believe him. And second, he took the warnings and threats of the entities to heart and wondered if it really was in his best interest to keep quiet. So he quietly wrote down the details of his encounter, but put it aside, determined that at least for the time being, he wasn't going to tell anybody what had happened. Well, the entities weren't through with him yet, though, and shortly after that, he had another odd experience. He was lying down in his bed in his attic room when he saw a flashing blue light and once again left his body. Well, this time, though, he was still in the room, and although it was outside of his body, he could look around the room as if he was wide awake. And to his shock, he saw standing right there in front of him 3 humanoid creatures wearing black clothing, the typical appearance of men in black. And his later admission of being visited by the men in black is indeed the most likely origin of the whole men in black or the MIB phenomenon. And ever since, there's been some speculation over whether these men in black who said to directly harass UFO witnesses and researchers are government agents or extraterrestrials themselves. And unless world governments have technology and capabilities far beyond the scope of the average person, and they had them back in the 50s, the terrestrial hypothesis for the MIB seems unlikely. I will point out that we do have technology far beyond what most of us are aware of. Now, most UFO researchers are indeed of the opinion MIBs are themselves extraterrestrials in nature, and for some reason are hell-bent on covering up the UFO phenomena. And the rest of Bender's account follows all the themes that have become so common in the MIB stories. In efforts to keep him quiet, they seem to use a two-pronged approach. They told him it was in the best interest of all parties involved that these things remain secret, and they assured him nobody would believe anything he said, even if he did talk. Well, there are a lot of cases of UFO experiences being visited by these strange MIB agents and them act in this odd manner. And for those that encounter these ubiquitous men in black, they're shocked and mystified. They're shocked at the fact they might be not only believe their encounter, now others would laugh at them, of course, but the MIBs take it seriously, and they might even feel some relief that somebody finally believed them. Well, that sense of belief, though, was quickly dispelled as the MIBs become aggressive and begin to harass, intimidate, and silence witnesses. And these discussions quickly devolve into the basic diatribe of, I know what you saw, it's real, but you better not talk about it. And even though the MIB confirmed that what the witnesses saw was real, they assure the witnesses nobody else is going to believe them, so they might as well shut up about it. And they're also known to make odd declarations about how keeping quiet's in the best interest of national security. And if that doesn't work, they declare it's in the best interest of the planet. And getting really grandiose, they've been even heard to state that secrecy about UFOs is in the best interest of the universe. And what's so vital about UFOs visiting Earth is that these strange dark-shaded figures have certainly blurred out that it was in the best interest of the entire universe that UFO witnesses keep quiet about what they've seen. I mean, quite frankly, that is beyond bizarre. Bizarre enough that with Bender, the MIB seemed to fall back on their tried and true assurance nobody's going to believe him no matter what he said. And they actually ended this latest encounter by stating that although he might be inclined to write about what he saw, they were absolutely certain nobody's going to believe him even if he did. And Bender, for his part, didn't come right out and spill the beans about his encounters, but in the subsequent days, he did hint to his readers something strange had happened to him. Well, this got the attention of an associate of Bender's, Gray Barker, who was a journalist and fellow investigator into the strange phenomenon of UFOs. Barker was just as interested as everybody else to know what Bender had discovered. It came as a shock. Just days after he declared he was on the verge of a major discovery, he suddenly backed down. Bender not only backed down, he shut down his entire operation and closed the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Well, that shocking development led Barker to write his own book, not just on the subject of UFOs, but on the subject of why somebody like Bender would feel so intimidated as to suddenly stop talking about the subject entirely. And his book was aptly titled, They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. Well, Barker didn't have much to go on in his book, but he made note of how strange it was that Bender had suddenly reversed course. He also made note of how it seemed this sudden silence wasn't something just isolated to Bender. It was his contention. It was a concerted effort to shut down all discussion about UFO phenomena. But you have to ask yourself why this would be. As it pertained to Bender, he did eventually come out of the shadows. He came forward several years later, in 1962, with a story so bizarre that, just as the MIBs had predicted, nobody seemed to believe him. The book Flying Saucers and the Three Men was so weird, even Barker was heard saying that maybe Bender dreamed the whole thing up. Funny thing is, after this brief return to the spotlight, Bender, chastened by all the laughter his odd story provoked, once again backed down and got out of scrutiny and never openly talked about UFOs or aliens again. He ended up living well into his 90s, passed away in 2016. Apparently put the topic of UFOs behind him for good. One way or the other, Bender had been silenced. He went on to run a hotel in California. Now, from Albert K. Bender, let's turn to Major Donald E. Keyhoe, and what's referred to as the kneecapping of NICAP. Now, Keyhoe was a military man used to the notion of organizations operating under different compartmentalized layers of authority. It was when he began looking into the UFO phenomenon in the 1950s and 60s, he became thoroughly convinced that there was a secret compartment in the U.S. government that monitored the UFO research. And he called this group the Silence Group. It's his contention this group actively discredited, debunked, or silenced those who were getting too close to what the UFO phenomenon was really all about. He made it part of his own life's work to try and determine who these people, if they were actually people, might be and why they were silencing UFO witnesses. And considering how much he pushed against such nefarious forces, it shouldn't be surprising to find that he faced some pushback of his own. He wrote what was considered an explosive book on the topic, entitled The Flying Saucer Conspiracy. Now, he was a veteran of the Air Force. He documented a lot of strange incidents from unidentified aerial phenomena, including a shocking incident in which an F-89C fighter plane vanished right before the mystified eyes of radar controllers on the ground. It was officially listed as having crashed, but a report was leaked from the Air Force in 1958 that painted an entirely different picture. Radar operators on the ground swore that a large unidentified blip appeared on their radar screen, approached the plane, the blip that represented the fighter plane. Next thing they knew, the larger blip swallowed the smaller one. So you have to ask yourself, did the aliens beam the bewildered fighter pilot, plane and all, aboard an alien mothership? Well, as fantastic as this might sound at first blush, there's no other explanation for what happened, and neither the fighter plane or any wreckage from his plane was ever found. And the pilot was never heard from again. Well, these are the sort of shocking incidents that Keyhoe himself investigated, and the powers that be didn't want him to talk about. Nevertheless, he persevered and went on to found the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, or NECAP, one of the largest, most prolific UFO research outfits ever established. Well, his military credentials are key to lending credibility to the organization. It was Keyhoe that could speak with authority when he rebuffed claims that UFO sightings were the result of temperature inversions or other artifacts of radar. Also able to dig up remarks and comments made by other Air Force officials that seemed to directly contradict many of the claims that faulty radar artifacts were the cause of many UFO disturbances. Keyhoe, in fact, once quoted none other than General Roger Ramey, who went on record to state the Air Force, in compliance with its mission of air defense of the U.S., must assume responsibility for the investigation of any object or phenomenon in the air over the United States. Fighter units have been instructed to investigate any object observed or established as existing by radar tracks and intercept any airborne object identified as hostile or showing hostile interest. It should be interpreted to mean the air defense pilot's been instructed to fire haphazardly on anything that flies. In other words, fighter jets wouldn't be scrambled for any old blip on the radar screen. It would be scrambled for real or quite serious threats that appeared. It was Keyhoe's contention that fighter jets that crashed or even vanished in pursuit of these objects weren't chasing birds, balloons, or radar inversions. He insisted that radar operators were professionals who were professionally trained to know what was real and what wasn't. But according to Keyhoe, radar operators knew what a false return was and would make a fuss about it. He also pointed to other off-the-cuff remarks by Air Force officials, such as the U.S. Air Force spokesperson who was heard to state, "We don't know what these things are." Because of the notion that government didn't really know what was happening, that Keyhoe developed a theory that he tried to cover him up in order to avoid what he called a public panic. But the notion that world governments might cover up information about UFOs to avoid panicking the public is now a mainstream theory used to explain why these things might be kept secret. Nevertheless, Keyhoe wanted the government to talk about what it knew on the topic, and feeling as if the wind was in his sails by the 60s, NICAP attempted to get congressional hearings on the topic of UFOs. Although he managed to generate quite a bit of public interest on the topic, Congress refused to even entertain the notion of discussing UFOs and the potential for alien visitation But times have in fact changed. The 2020s, Congress has held multiple official hearings on the subject. In 2023, congressional representatives even grilled a former Air Force officer, a member of the military intelligence, David Grush, on the matter. He took the stand under oath and openly admitted U.S. government had not only retrieved off-world technology from downed craft, but also non-human biologics. Of course, to be absolutely clear, as shocking as his revelations were, there wasn't any proof shown to back him up. At the end of the day, it was just his testimony. Even though he said these things under oath under penalty of perjury, his testimony is ultimately nothing more than hearsay. Although some later rather shocking hearsay, it was still hearsay all the same. And even though Keyhoe would have loved to have made that testimony back in his day, pretty soon he'd fall victim to what he called the silence group. In the late 1960s, his UFO research group, NICAP, began to fail. There were claims of financial mismanagement. In 1969, they went into bankruptcy. And Keyhoe himself was targeted for corruption and misuse of funds. And in the dust-up, even NICAP's monthly publication, UFO Investigator, suffered. Meant to be a monthly periodical, but due to lack of funds, it was stopped. It would have been worse for Keyhoe was when NICAP's own board looked into financial matters and discovered that Mr. Keyhoe was improperly withholding Social Security taxes from his employees and didn't report it to the government. In other words, he was accused of pocketing the funds for his own use. This finding led to him being ousted from NICAP entirely, and NICAP itself disintegrated in the 70s. Right when they seemed to be on the cusp of figuring out something about UFOs and aggressively pushing for congressional hearings, the group simply fell apart. Well, the question becomes at this point, was Keyhoe really mismanaging the outfit, or were there irregularities that led to the group's downfall that resulted in nefarious characters or goals to stop their efforts and silence them? Was Keyhoe and NICAP both victims of the same silencing group Keyhoe himself talked about? Well, he lived a fairly quiet life after this debacle and passed away in 1988 at the age of 91. Last years were quiet, and his once vocal voice on UFOs is likely to be quiet on that matter as well. Was he silenced? And nobody seems to know for sure. Well, let's talk about MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. We know NICAP was dismantled in the 70s. Another UFO organization founded in 1969 is still going strong today. But it had been without its challenges. One of those challenges being when in 1994, a leading member of the group, Ron Johnson, inexplicably dropped dead during a UFO conference. At that point in time, he was Deputy Director of Investigations for MUFON. He was only 43 years old when he died. And he was in great health and didn't have any known medical conditions. In fact, he just recently undergone his regular physical, which also indicated he was in good shape. But on June 9, 1994, something unusual happened. That evening, he was attending a meeting for the Society of Scientific Exploration at a prearranged location in Austin, Texas. He was conducting a slideshow for the audience with the lights turned down low. Everybody's attention was on the screen. They heard a gas come from Johnson. When the lights were cut on, he was seen slumped over in his seat. His face was a nightmarish purplish red, and blood could be seen dripping out of his nose. And due to the discoloration of his face and the gasping sound he made and the blood coming from his nose, it looked like the man might have been strangled. After the light came on, though, the only person visible was the slumped-over form of Ron Johnson himself. If somebody had strangled him, they'd either faster than the flash, or they could somehow render themselves invisible. Such things were said in a highly facetious manner, but considering some of the other things have been attributed to the UFO phenomena, there may be some truth to this. 2024, after all, the U.S. military released footage of a unidentified aerial phenomenon that looked almost like a mechanical floating jellyfish and had somehow crossed over a military base in Iraq. Referred to as the jellyfish UAP, the object could only be seen in infrared and was invisible to the naked eye. Well, people on the internet had an absolute field day with this one and managed to use high-tech imaging software to zoom in on the grainy image enough to reveal what seemed to be startling details. When they zoomed in, what initially looked like an unidentified blob appeared almost mechanical in nature, almost like some sort of hovering vehicle with mechanical arms. And on top of the object, there even appeared to be a humanoid figure to control to this decidedly alien-looking hovercraft. Of course, these things are still open to interpretation. In many ways, the grainy footage is like a Rorschach test for true believers and skeptics alike. They seem to see whatever they want to see, but for the group that didn't want to see it, the theory is as mundane as the image is actually bird crap dripping off the lens of the camera have been offered as an alternative explanation. It's often bizarre cases, an ongoing mystery, but who had entertained the idea an invisible jellyfish actually did float over a base in Iraq? If they would trespass on otherwise secure military bases, it wouldn't be hard for them to waltz into a UFO convention held by MIBs. Now, nobody says that's what happened, but the look on Ron Johnson's face was pretty scary. Scary like somebody who just witnessed the tentacles of a jellyfish UAP wrapped around their own throat. In any case, to this day, nobody really knows what happened to Ron Johnson. In a few seconds that his slides were on the screen and the lights in the room were off. Whatever happened, though, certainly did up in that particular UFO conference. In the confusion and uproar and aftermath of his death, people forgot all about whatever it was he was trying to present to them. But was it important? Did it even matter? Nobody really knows because Ron Johnson was killed and whatever finished his sentence, let alone his ill-fated presentation. Well, from Ron Johnson dying during a MUFON conference, let's talk about an airplane pilot who disappeared. Frederick Valentich. For those of you who know the story, you might summarize it that he was a young guy interested in UFOs, also an accomplished pilot. One day he flew over water, reported a strange sighting, and vanished. Plane and all. Having said that, you might wonder how this young man could be considered a UFO researcher. But if one were to delve deeper into the life of Frederick Valentich, you'd realize he was indeed a UFO researcher in his own right. Even though he didn't get to live as long as other researchers in the field, he'd already compiled a lot of data on the subject. And the fact that he was a pilot trained to observe other aircraft also gave him a degree of authority on the subject of unidentified flying objects. At the time he and his plane went missing, this 22-year-old Australian pilot was a well-trained aviator and very well read on the topic of aliens and UFOs. It's October 21st, 1978. Valentich flew a small Cessna plane from Melbourne, Australia with the intention of flying across Bass Strait and ending on King Island. Well, you might ask why he was making that trip. Because the reason behind his flight actually gets lost in the story. He wasn't just out on a joyride. He was flying to King Island for a very specific reason, and that reason had to do with UFOs. There had recently been several reports of strange cigar-shaped unidentified flying objects hovering over the Bass Straits. Reports that are already under investigation by Australia's Victorian UFO Research Society, or VUFORS as it was referred to. Rather than letting the VUFORS have all the fun, Valentich decided he wanted to make use of his piloting skills to fly directly over this UFO hotspot just in case he might see something unusual. Now, by all accounts, he was a brave young man. He was willing to throw himself headlong into the unknown in order to find answers to some of the most startling questions. So, that October evening, about 6:19 p.m., his plane lifted off the runway at Melbourne's Moorabbin Airport, flying a Cessna he'd rented just for this purpose. Also, meticulously filed his flight plan to King Island. And in making any mention of UFOs, he simply stated he was going to the island to sightsee and pick up some crayfish. What's surprising, he wouldn't make his true intention known. I mean, to a lot of folks, UFOs are still a taboo subject. And in those days, it was much more taboo. It was when he was nearly halfway over the strait that he suddenly reached air traffic control back in Melbourne. Sounded a bit unnerved and excited at this point in his flight as he asked a question, are there any known traffic below 5,000 feet? He was asking because he saw something highly unusual flying just under 5,000 feet. Now, the air traffic controller, whose name was Steve Roby, responded to his inquiry, stated there were no known aircraft in the area. And this alerted Valentik to a notion he was already considering. His confirmation of a known aircraft in the region led to his realization he was dealing with an unknown aircraft. In other words, he was dealing with an unidentified flying object. When he alerted air traffic control, it was indeed an unknown large craft hovering below 5,000 feet. Roby tried to get some details from Valentik, but initially all he would say was it was a brilliantly lit object, extremely bright, what appeared to be landing lights. The craft was just above him and rapidly passed overhead, as Valentik indicated by stating the aircraft was just passing over me at least 1,000 feet above. And then Valentik asked, is there any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity? Roby again confirmed there was no known aircraft in the area. Roby asked Valentik to describe what he was seeing, and Valentik now had a better idea of its shape. He said it's just flying past. It's a long shape. Can't identify more than that. It's got such speed. We were seeing a fast-flying, long-shaped object. In other words, a cigar-shaped UFO, in all likelihood. The craft was apparently now darting around at high speed, and Valentik suddenly said it's vanished. Moments later, he said it was back and was hovering right over him. Well, this led to the haunting during this transmission made by Valentik. He was sounding alarm. He radioed air traffic control. Melbourne, that strange craft is hovering right on top of me again, and it's not an aircraft. Well, those final words were followed by a muffled cry and strange metallic noise before the transmission ended. To this day, that was the last anybody heard from Valentik. What happened to him, nobody knows, but not for lack of trying. October 21st, 1978, is officially declared to be missing. Next day, a massive search of Bass Strait, where his airplane was last known to fly, took place. A lot of folks figured he must have crashed, and if that was the case, the wreckage of his plane should have been discovered during this massive search. But to all intents and purposes, Frederick Valentik, as well as his plane, vanished. Official investigation into this disappearance was conducted by Australia's Aviation Administration and spanned from October 1978 to May of 1982. And after that 4-year investigation came to a close, a final report was issued that literally had no explanation. The official conclusion was the reason for the disappearance of the aircraft has not been determined. After 4 years of wasted time and money and effort, the Australian Aviation Administration admitted they had no clues what happened to this skilled pilot and UFO researcher. Nevertheless, some other strange theories were put forth by the public in the aftermath. Some more imaginative than others. One time, the theory that he was hit by falling space junk was among the more popular proposed explanation. But as intriguing as this might be, it doesn't match up with the verbal evidence of what Valentik had witnessed. Over an extended period of time, he clearly saw an object under intelligent control moving back and forth across his line of sight. Being hit by space junk, on the other hand, would have been more like being struck by lightning. It happened so fast and suddenly he wouldn't have been able to even know when it hit him. So the space junk theory doesn't match up with his extended remarks about an object hovering nearby and engaging in extensive maneuvers around his airplane. The other theory, and one that seems to try and discredit Valentik as a skilled pilot, is the notion his plane actually flipped upside down without him realizing it, and the lights he saw were his own landing lights reflected on the water. This theory said Valentik, in his disorientation, mistook this reflection for another craft and thought that craft was getting closer to him as he, in fact, got closer to the water. Then further theorized that maybe he realized what was happening right before he about to hit the waves, and this explains his last words of it's not an aircraft. These theorists suggest that it was his last moments he realized his mistake and wasn't witnessing an unidentified aircraft, but simply a reflection of his own landing lights, moments before he crashed himself into the water. But this explanation neglects the fact that the object Valentik saw was highly mobile. At different points, we're seeing flying over it, beside him, and then under him. Needless to say, a stationary reflection on the waves wouldn't do all that. And maybe more importantly, this theory doesn't explain why there was no wreckage to be found. If you made a mistake and crashed into the water, okay, I can accept that, but there would be no wreckage. Something should have washed up somewhere by now. And maybe an even greater point is that the aforementioned fact that Valentik was an avid UFO researcher, and he was determined to get to the bottom of recent sightings that have been witnessed over Bass Strait. Could it be he was close to uncovering something that someone or something didn't want him to know about? Is that why both he and his plane seemed to be snatched up right out of the air and never be seen or heard from again? And adding to the conspiracy, there's another interesting angle in all this, because Bass Strait wasn't just known for UFO sightings, but also for drug smuggling. Now, drug smugglers often navigated through Bass Strait in order to bring drug shipments to Australia. And having said that, this idea has to be considered. Could it be that this budding UFO investigator didn't as much run afoul of aliens as he did drug smugglers? Were they somehow responsible for his disappearance? And in addition to UFOs and drug smuggling, there's also the theory that Valentich literally got caught in the headlights of a top-secret UFO project later known as Strategic Defense Initiative. This project later became famous as a result of Ronald Reagan announcing its development to the world. But according to a former NASA employee, Dr. Richard Haynes, it was in the works as early as the late 1970s, just prior to Reagan taking office. Now, Haynes claims the U.S. was utilizing a top-secret facility in Australia known as Pine Gap to test out high-intensity laser beams, which were designed to shoot objects out of the sky. Later made the bombshell but unproven claim that Valentich was actually collateral damage caused by the early testing phase of the Strategic Defense Initiative. There's a lot of theories over what might have happened to this budding UFO researcher. The rabbit hole appears to only get deeper as we probe the depths of what might have happened to him. UFO researcher not afraid to fly his plane right in the middle of a mystery, only to become part of it himself. Then from Valentich, we turn to John Murphy, who got the Kecksburg treatment. 1965, something rather strange crashed in the middle of the woods in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. The object was seen by multiple people during its descent and was tracked by several radar stations as it went down. Before the military could cordon off the area, a lot of folks had gathered around the crash site. And among these was a local woman named Frances Kaup. Now, she couldn't help but notice the commotion because her home was near the wooded area where the object had fallen from the sky. Her kids had watched the object crash, been excitedly yammering at her about the better part of the evening. She ended up calling the local radio station, WHJB. The director of that station, John Murphy, alerted to this scoop of the story, decided to head down to the crash site to check it out for himself. According to testimony of others who later spoke with him, he confirmed that a highly unusual structured craft was found resting in that impact crater. Along with the strange sight of the crashed object, Murphy also witnessed police escorting personnel, Geiger counters, and subsequently examining the object. Immediate chaos of the crash, access to the area hadn't been sufficiently restricted yet, and civilians like Murphy were still pushing their luck, daring to get close to the object. Murphy supposedly took photos of the object to confirm what he'd witnessed. Shortly after this confirmation, he interviewed Miss Kaup and her children, also interviewed some of the guys with Geiger counters, taking notes for what he likely thought would be a major story. He planned to discuss his findings on the air in the program he had called Object in the Woods. Well, right before the planned broadcast of his radio program, he's visited by government officials who were said to have taken his photos, told him to be careful about what he talked about on the radio. Whoever these people were, they apparently really got to Murphy, for it was then a much more subdued, maybe even timid Murphy who appeared on the air with a scaled-back, heavily edited, some say sanitized, airing of his radio program. A few years later, he would be tragically killed in a hit-and-run accident, one that was never solved. His death was written off as a horrendous accident, but as anybody who's investigated the untimely deaths of UFO researchers might agree, the sheer number of freak accidents that befall these particular folks is actually startling. There was another UFO enthusiast who met his end by way of being pulverized by a fellow motorist. But of course, his death was immediately labeled an accident. Well, from Murphy, we got time for one more. Amy Eskridge. Paperclipper's life was cut short. Now, that's a name that often come up in a potential UFO researcher whose findings were silenced. She was just 34 years old when she's found dead from a gunshot wound, June 11, 2022. And although it will later be claimed that the gunshot wound was self-inflicted, there's always been skeptics. She was allegedly on the cusp of making incredible breakthroughs in the realm of anti-gravity. She was a genius scientist, researcher, and CEO for a company that specialized in breaking through traditional barriers of physics. Through her death, she led a research group called the Institute of Exotic Science. Now, this institute was determined to find ways around the conventional understanding of physics, so things deemed impossible could actually be made a reality. So the thought is she came close to new discovery, and as a result, she was silenced. Although it could be just a sheer coincidence, another aspect of this case that is conspiracy theories talking is the fact that her paternal grandparents have the name of Vance. And those who follow American politics know full well that the Vice President of the U.S. Is a man by the name of J.D. Vance. And this could be sheer coincidence, entirely unrelated, but it's got the attention of some conspiracy theorists. Global social media platform Twitter, now known as X, is indeed full of chatter about how Amy Eskridge was somehow working on the recovered UFO technology in order to find a breakthrough use for the technology in terms of human engineering. One individual recently remarked about how many professional scientists like Amy have been intimidated and relegated into an isolated and often insufferable position. Although her obituary is ordinary, it omits some of the more stunning details of her life, and some stunning details which she herself had claimed just prior to her passing. She referred to herself as a paper clipper, which was a shorthand reference to claims she made of being a descent of German scientists and other personnel were brought over to the U.S. And most were brought to Huntsville, Alabama. Operation Paperclip was the government's attempt to bring under U.S. control a lot of German scientists, many of whom were far in advance of anything we even have today. Despite the seemingly sensational nature of Operation Paperclip, that's not a conspiracy theory, it's a verified fact. Germans had an edge on technology for much of the war with the production of such things as jet fighters and rockets. After World War II, the U.S. was deeply concerned about the science of Germany falling into the hands of the Soviets and building the weapons for Soviet Russia. In order to prevent this, the CIA launched an operation codenamed Paperclip, the object being to gather as many of these paperclip pushing scientists as possible. Ms. Eskridge's belief that she was part of this legacy. She called herself a paperclipper, in reference to her alleged claim to be a descendant of some of these German scientists who were smuggled into the U.S. Since her death in 2022, her life has been heavily researched by a former UK counterintelligence agent by the name of Frank Milbert. He's gone on record to state Ms. Eskridge was one of the smartest scientists of her generation, showing a tremendous amount of promise. He does contend that she had somehow had a falling out with some of her colleagues in the top secret circles in which she worked, and they began to track and conduct heavy surveillance on her. And it's been alleged that the mind of Ms. Eskridge just might have been tapped to crack the puzzle of back-engineered alien technology. And apparently her handlers were afraid that she might reveal information she shouldn't. And that was why she was being so heavily tracked and followed. She actually managed to befriend Milburn, befriend Eskridge just prior to her demise, so got a personal stake in figuring out what exactly happened to her. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. I'll be back tomorrow and talk more about silenced UFO truth seekers. Until then, Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show, saying have a truly great